The sun was setting over Millfield when Senator James Jim Caldwell pulled his dusty pickup truck into the gravel lot of his grandfather's factory. The weathered brick building stood as a testament to time, its faded sign still reading Caldwell Manufacturing, just as it had for the past 60 years. Jim sat for a moment, taking it all in. 3 tours in Afghanistan had changed him, given him perspective on what really mattered in life. And now, back home, this old building represented not just his family legacy, but a chance to do something meaningful. Jim climbed out of his truck, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the building. His grandfather had built this place with his better hands after coming back from World War II. Now it was Jim's turn to breathe new life into these walls. "Hey there, stranger," called a friendly voice. Jim turned to see his childhood friend, Pete, walking over from the neighboring property. They had grown up together, racing bikes through these very lots long before any fancy houses had been built nearby. "Been a while," Jim said with a smile, shaking Pete's hand firmly. "How's the neighborhood treating you?" Pete glanced over his shoulder at the rows of pristine houses that now surrounded the old factory. "Well, it's changed a lot since we were kids. These new folks moved in with their fancy rules and neighborhood committees. They act like this area was always some kind of country club." Jim nodded, looking at the luxury development that had sprung up around his grandfather's property over the past decade. The contrast was stark. $1-million homes with manicured lawns just yards away from the industrial building that had stood here long before any developer had even laid eyes on Millfield. "I've heard about these homeowners associations," Jim said, walking with Pete toward the factory entrance. "Actually been doing some work on them in the state senate. Wrote most of the new HOA regulatory framework that passed last year." Pete raised his eyebrows. "No kidding. People around here probably don't even realize they've got a big-shot senator living next door." Jim laughed and shook his head. "And that's exactly how I want it, Pete. In the Capitol, I'm Senator Caldwell. But here, I'm just Jim from the old factory. Always have been, always will be." Inside, the factory was dusty but solid. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating floating dust particles and the ghostly shapes of old machinery. Jim ran his hand along a workbench his grandfather had used for decades. "I've got plans for this place," Jim said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Going to fix it up, get it running again. But not like before. I want to make this a place where veterans can work, learn skills, build a new life after service." Pete nodded approvingly. "That's a fine idea, Jim, real fine." Later that evening, Jim sat on the small back porch of the factory manager's office, which had a small living quarters his grandfather had used during busy production times. He'd made it comfortable enough to stay in while he worked on his plans. Looking out at the sunset, he could see the backs of the luxury homes that now bordered his property. Christmas lights twinkled from perfectly trimmed trees, and the sound of a neighborhood gathering drifted over on the breeze. Jim sipped his coffee, thinking about the veterans he'd served with, the men and women who deserved a chance to build something meaningful after giving so much to their country. This old place would be their chance, a place to belong, to work, to heal. Little did he know that just 3 houses down, a woman named Patricia Wilkinson was hosting her first meeting as president of the Millfield Estates Homeowners Association, and the old factory was the first item on her agenda. Patricia Wilkinson stood at her bay window, coffee cup in hand, glaring at the old brick factory that ruined her otherwise perfect view. She'd paid a small fortune for this house, and that eyesore wasn't part of the deal. $800,000 for this view, she muttered, taking a sip of her imported coffee. Patricia had moved to Millfield Estates just 8 months ago after accepting a generous retirement package from her position as vice president of operations at a national retail chain. For 30 years, she'd climbed the corporate ladder by making tough decisions and holding everyone to impossibly high standards. Her employees had nicknamed her the bulldozer behind her back, not for destroying things, but for flattening any obstacle in her path. The meeting starting in 10 minutes, Mrs. Wilkinson called her husband, Tom, from the kitchen. Unlike his wife, Tom was soft-spoken and easygoing. He'd learned long ago that life was easier when he stayed out of Patricia's way once she set her mind to something. Patricia straightened her pearl necklace and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her first meeting as HOA president needed to be perfect. She'd campaigned hard for this position, going door to door with promises of higher property values and community improvements. Most of her neighbors had voted for her simply because no one else wanted the job. The community center was only half full when Patricia called the meeting to order. Most of the faces were unfamiliar to her. She hadn't bothered to get to know many people in the neighborhood yet. First order of business, Patricia announced, clicking to the first slide of her presentation. On the screen appeared a photo of the old Caldwell factory, strategically shot at its worst angle during an overcast day. This monstrosity. A murmur went through the small crowd. An older gentleman in the back raised his hand. Yes? Patricia acknowledged him with slight impatience. That's Jim Caldwell's place. Been there since forever. Jim's grandfather built it back in the 40s. Patricia's smile didn't reach her eyes. I'm sure it has a charming history, but times change. Our neighborhood covenant clearly states that all properties must maintain aesthetic standards consistent with a luxury development. What Patricia didn't mention, and didn't know, was that the factory wasn't actually part of their HOA jurisdiction. She hadn't bothered to check the property records or zoning maps. In her previous corporate role, Patricia had learned that confidence often trumped facts. If you acted like you were right, most people assumed you were. I've prepared a full report, Patricia continued, handing out colored folders to the 12 people in attendance. As you can see, I've outlined a three-phase approach to community beautification, starting with addressing the most obvious violations. The folder contained dozens of pages of regulations, action items, and proposed fines, most of which Patricia had created herself, interpreting the existing HOA rules in the strictest possible way. But Jim's not even part of the older gentleman started to say. Moving on, Patricia interrupted, clicking to the next slide. Phase 2 includes standardizing mailbox heights and enforcing our lawn ornament restrictions. After the meeting, Patricia lingered, gathering her materials while eavesdropping on conversations around her. Most people seemed intimidated by her thoroughness, which she took as approval. Only 2 residents had openly questioned her factory plan, both older neighbors who claimed to know Jim from the factory. Walking home, Patricia paused at the edge of her property to take another look at the brick building in the distance. The setting sun cast a warm glow on its weathered walls, almost making it look dignified. But Patricia didn't see dignity or history. She saw a problem to solve, an obstacle to remove. 2 weeks, she said to herself, already drafting emails in her head to demolition companies she researched. 2 weeks, and that eyesore will be gone. What Patricia didn't realize was that she was about to bulldoze into a fight she couldn't win, with a man whose name was on the very laws she thought she was enforcing. The call came just as Jim was packing his overnight bag. The legislative session in the state capitol would keep him away from Millfield for 2 weeks. Not ideal timing, but duty called. Senator Caldwell speaking, he answered, tucking the phone between his ear and shoulder as he folded a shirt. Jim, it's Pete. Thought you should know there's some talk going around the neighborhood about your place. Jim sighed, sitting on the edge of his bed. What kind of talk? That new HOA president, Patricia Wilkinson. She had a meeting last night, showing pictures of your factory, calling it an eyesore. Got everyone worked up about property values. Jim rubbed his forehead. He'd expected something like this eventually, but had hoped to have more time to get the renovation plans underway first. Thanks for the heads up, Pete. I'll stop by her house before I leave town, try to clear things up. But Patricia wasn't home when Jim knocked on her door an hour later. Her husband, Tom, answered instead, looking uncomfortable. She's out running errands, Tom explained, not quite meeting Jim's eyes. I can tell how you stopped by. Please do, Jim said, handing Tom a business card. I'll be away for 2 weeks on state business, but I'd like to talk with her when I get back. The factory isn't actually within HOA jurisdiction, and I've got renovation plans I think would address her concerns. Tom nodded, looking at the card. His eyebrows raised slightly when he saw State Senator under Jim's name, but he didn't comment on it. I'll make sure she gets this, he promised. That card never made it to Patricia. Tom placed it on her desk, but by the time she returned home, she was too preoccupied with her plans to notice it. It eventually slipped behind the desk, where it would remain undiscovered for weeks to come. With Jim safely out of town, Patricia moved quickly. she scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time when most residents were at work. The email announcement mentioned only urgent community matters without specifying the factory. Only 7 residents showed up, mostly retirees and a couple who worked from home. Notably absent were the older neighbors who had questioned Patricia at the previous meeting. They were attending a veterans reunion in a neighboring town. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Patricia began, standing at the front of the nearly empty room. "We have an urgent situation requiring immediate action." She clicked through a new presentation, this one featuring close-up photos of peeling paint on one corner of the factory, an old loading dock with rust stains, and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete at the rear of the property. "These conditions violate multiple sections of our covenant," she declared. Section 7.3, no unsightly structures. Section 12.1, no commercial operations in residential zones. Section 15.6, proper maintenance of all visible structures. What Patricia didn't mention was that she'd taken these sections from a draft of covenant updates that hadn't actually been approved yet. Nor did she mention that the factory property wasn't even governed by their HOA rules. "I move that we take immediate remedial action," Patricia said, not waiting for questions. "All in favor?" 5 hands went up automatically, residents who trusted that their HOA president had done her homework. 1 resident, a quiet woman named Judy, abstained, looking uncertain. "Motion carried," Patricia announced quickly. "I'll handle the implementation details." After the meeting, Judy approached Patricia hesitantly. "Shouldn't we talk to the owner first? My husband mentioned the factory's been there since before our houses were even built." Patricia's smile was tight. "We've made multiple attempts to contact the owner," she lied smoothly. "Unfortunately, he's been unresponsive. At this point, we need to protect our community's interests." That evening, Patricia made 3 phone calls, 1 to a demolition company, 1 to a document preparation service, and 1 to her friend at City Hall who could expedite permits without asking too many questions. "Everything needs to be taken care of within the next 10 days, she instructed each of them, "before anyone can interfere." Meanwhile, Jin was knee-deep in legislation at the Capitol, completely unaware that a bulldozer with his factory's address was already being scheduled. The rumble of heavy machinery woke Frank Johnson at 6:17 a.m. The retired postal worker had always been a light sleeper, and the sound of diesel engines idling was definitely not part of the normal morning birdsong in Millfield Estates. Frank shuffled to his front window in his bathrobe and slippers, pulling aside the curtain to see what the commotion was about. Through the early morning mist, he could make out the yellow shape of a bulldozer and 2 dump trucks parked alongside Jim's factory. Men in hard hats were unloading equipment, while a woman in a crisp pantsuit stood nearby, clipboard in hand. "What in the world?" Frank muttered, reaching for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Pete's number. "Pete, it's Frank from down the street. There's something happening at Jim's factory. Cut bulldozers and everything." 20 minutes later, a small group of neighbors had gathered at the edge of the property, watching as workers began setting up barriers around the newer wing of the factory. The section Jim had already started renovating for his veteran training program. Patricia Wilkinson stood a short distance away, her back straight, checking items off a list with quick, satisfied flicks of her pen. When she noticed the gathering crowd, she walked over with a practiced smile. "Good morning, everyone," she said brightly. "I know this might seem sudden, but the HOA board approved this action last week. This eyesore has been dragging down our property values for too long." Pete pushed his way to the front of the small crowd. "This isn't right, Patricia. Jim's away at the Capitol. Did anyone even talk to him about this?" Patricia's smile didn't falter. "Multiple notices were sent," she lied, patting the folder she carried. "Unfortunately, the owner has been unresponsive. The board has unanimously decided to move forward with community improvement actions." She handed Pete a document, an official-looking form with the HOA letterhead and several signatures at the bottom. "This isn't legal," Pete said, scanning the paper. "This property isn't even part of the HOA." Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. "I assure you, everything is in order. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to oversee the operation." She turned away, signaling to the demolition foreman who had been waiting for her approval. With a nod, he climbed into the cab of the bulldozer and fired up the engine. Pete frantically dialed Jim's number, but got sent straight to voicemail. Legislative sessions often meant phones were turned off or silenced. In desperation, he called Jim's assistant at the senator's office. "This is an emergency," Pete explained urgently. "They're tearing down his factory right now." The first crash came moments later, the bulldozer ramming into the newly installed windows of the East Wing. Glass shattered and the metal frames buckled under the force. Inside, custom equipment Jim had purchased for the veteran training program, expensive computer-controlled machinery that had been delivered just last week, was crushed under falling debris. Judy, the hesitant resident from the HOA meeting, filmed everything on her phone, her hands shaking with disbelief. "Stop this," Pete shouted, trying to approach the bulldozer, but two workers blocked his path. "Sir, this is a demolition zone. You need to stay back for safety." By the time Jim's truck came tearing into the gravel lot 2 hours later, the damage was extensive. The entire East Wing, the newest part of the building, had been reduced to rubble. Dust still hung in the air, coating everything in a fine gritty layer. Pieces of metal and splintered wood poked out from the debris pile like broken bones. Jim slammed his truck door, his face pale with shock as he surveyed the destruction. The special lathe his grandfather had used to make parts for military vehicles during the Korean War lay twisted and broken among the rubble. The framed photo of 3 generations of Caldwell men that had hung in the office was nowhere to be seen. In the center of it all stood Patricia, still checking items off her clipboard, a small smile of satisfaction playing at the corners of her mouth. She hadn't noticed Jim's arrival yet, too busy directing workers to clear away larger pieces of debris. "Load everything into the trucks," she was saying. "I want this place cleared by sunset." Jim stood motionless for a long moment, dust settling on his suit. He hadn't even taken the time to change after rushing from the legislative session. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he took in the devastation of his family's legacy. The small crowd of neighbors fell silent, watching him, waiting for his reaction. Pete moved to Jim's side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I tried to stop them, Jim. I'm sorry." Jim nodded once, his jaw tight, then took a deep breath and started walking toward Patricia. His footsteps crunched over broken glass and splintered wood. Someone in the crowd whispered, "This is gonna be good," but Jim heard nothing except the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. Patricia was still writing notes on her clipboard, directing a worker about where to move a pile of debris, when she felt the crowd's attention shift. She turned and saw Jim approaching, his face unreadable, but his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. "Excuse me," she said, recovering quickly and lifting her chin. "This is a demolition zone. You'll need to." "I'm James Caldwell," Jim said quietly. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Patricia's smile remained fixed, but her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume you received our notices. The Homeowners Association has determined that your property violates multiple sections of our community covenant. We're simply enforcing." "My grandfather built this factory in 1947, Jim interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made everyone around them go completely still. "He made parts for tractors so farmers could feed their families. During the Korean War, he retooled to make components for military vehicles. My father took over in '78, and I inherited it 5 years ago." Patricia shifted her weight, clutching her clipboard tighter. "While the history is certainly interesting, Mr. Caldwell, the fact remains. I was renovating that wing," Jim continued as if she hadn't spoken, pointing to the demolished section, "to create a training facility for veterans. Men and women who served their country and needed a place to learn new skills. The equipment you just destroyed cost nearly $300,000. A murmur went through the crowd. Patricia's smile faded slightly, but she stood her ground. "Mr. Caldwell, I sympathize with your project, but the HOA rules clearly state—" "There are no HOA rules governing this property," Jim said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "This land isn't part of your jurisdiction, never has been." Patricia laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "I assure you, I've reviewed the documentation thoroughly. This property falls under Section—" "No, It doesn't. Jim's interruption was soft but final. And do you know how I can be so certain? Because I wrote the law. Patricia blinked, confused. What are you talking about? Jim reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a business card and held it out to her. Patricia took it automatically, then froze as she read the words printed there. State Senator James P. Caldwell, State HOA, Subcommittee on Property Rights and Zoning. I authored the Homeowners Association regulatory framework that was passed last year, Jim said, addressing not just Patricia now, but the growing crowd of onlookers. I know exactly what powers HOAs have and what they don't have. And you, Mrs. Wilkinson, have just committed criminal property destruction, fraud, and likely a dozen other violations I'll have to check with the Attorney General about. The blood drained from Patricia's face. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered on the ground, paper scattering in the light breeze. The demolition foreman, who had been watching the exchange with growing concern, took off his hard hat. Ma'am, you told us you had all the proper permits and authorizations. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Shut it down, the foreman called to his crew. Everyone, tools down. Now. The workers, sensing trouble, immediately stopped what they were doing, exchanging nervous glances. Jim turned to address the gathered neighbors, his voice steady and clear. I'd appreciate it if those of you who witnessed what happened here today would be willing to give statements. My office will be in touch. As he spoke, Patricia began backing away, her perfect composure completely shattered. She bumped into Tom, who had just arrived, drawn by rumors spreading through the neighborhood. Patricia? Tom asked, looking from his wife's pale face to the destruction behind her. What have you done? The days following the demolition unfolded like a nightmare for Patricia Wilkinson. It started with a knock on her door at 7:30 a.m., just as she was pouring her morning coffee. 2 officers stood on her doorstep, their expressions serious. Patricia Wilkinson, we have a warrant for your arrest. Tom watched in stunned silence as his wife was read her rights in their marble-tiled foyer, the same foyer she'd been so proud of when they bought the house. The charges included criminal destruction of property, fraud, forgery, and filing false documents. Patricia spent 6 hours at the county jail before Tom arrived with their lawyer to post bail. She'd never imagined herself sitting on a hard bench in a holding cell, still wearing yesterday's pantsuit, now wrinkled and stained with dust from the demolition site. This is ridiculous, she told their attorney, a nervous young man named Brian who typically handled real estate closings, not criminal defense. I was acting in my capacity as HOA president. The association should cover all of this. Brian cleared his throat. That's actually going to be a problem, Mrs. Wilkinson. I spoke with the HOA's insurance company this morning. They're denying coverage because your actions were. He hesitated, searching for a diplomatic term, outside the scope of your authority. What does that mean? Tom asked, his voice tight with worry. It means you're personally liable, Brian explained. For everything. Meanwhile, across town, Jim sat in a wood-paneled office across from Georgia Lawrence, the state attorney general. They'd known each other for 15 years, having started in the state legislature together. This is personal for me, Georgia, Jim said, passing her photos of the destruction. That factory wasn't just a building, it was my family's legacy. Georgia examined the photos, her expression grim. The evidence is overwhelming, Jim. Falsified documents, bogus permits, deliberate misrepresentation. And the timing, waiting until you were away at the Capitol, shows clear intent. I don't want to ruin her life, Jim admitted, but I can't let this slide either. Those machines were meant to help veterans rebuild their lives. Georgia nodded, understanding the conflict in her old friend. We'll pursue this by the book, no special treatment, harder or easier. The lawsuit Jim filed the next day made the front page of the local newspaper. The headline read, State Senator's Historic Factory Illegally Demolished by HOA President. Patricia's phone rang constantly. Journalists seeking comment, neighbors calling to distance themselves from her actions, and HOA board members resigning their positions. The worst call came from the HOA's lawyer, informing her that the board had voted unanimously to remove her as president and to file their own lawsuit against her for misrepresenting their authority. You acted without board approval, the lawyer explained coldly. The emergency meeting minutes you submitted were fabricated. Only 3 board members were actually present, not the 7 required for quorum. Patricia sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal papers, watching her carefully constructed life crumble. The estimate for damages to Jim's property alone exceeded $450,000, more than half of what they'd paid for their house. We might have to sell, Tom said quietly, reviewing their finances. Even then, we might not cover everything. The doorbell rang again. Tom answered it, returning with another envelope. It's from the demolition company, he said. They're suing us too for fraud and reputational damage. Patricia's hands shook as she opened the envelope. The demolition company wanted $200,000 for damage to their business reputation and lost contracts following the incident. Outside their window, a news van parked across the street. A reporter stood on the sidewalk, microphone in hand, filming an introduction with the Wilkinsons' house in the background. I was just following the rules, Patricia whispered, more to herself than to Tom. I was just trying to make the neighborhood better. Tom looked at his wife, seeing for the first time how small she appeared without her clipboard and authority. Rules only work when you understand them, Patricia, he said gently. And it helps if they actually apply to the situation. Through their living room window, they could see Jim across the street, speaking calmly to the reporter, pointing toward what remained of his family's factory. 6 weeks after the bulldozing incident, the early morning air at the factory site buzzed with activity. Dozens of people milled around, carrying lumber, unloading equipment, and clearing the last of the debris. Pickup trucks lined the gravel driveway, their beds filled with building materials donated by local businesses. Jim stood by a folding table that had been set up as a makeshift headquarters, reviewing blueprints with the contractor. He looked up as Pete approached, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. Thought you could use this, Pete said, handing Jim a cup. Some turnout, huh? Jim nodded, taking a sip. Never expected anything like this. What had started as a small group of neighbors offering to help clean up had snowballed into something much bigger. After the local newspaper ran the story, people Jim had never met began showing up, tools in hand, asking how they could help. Veterans from across the state drove hours to pitch in. Construction companies offered materials at cost or free. A local architect volunteered to redesign the damaged wing. Senator called a voice from the edge of the property. Jim turned to see Judy, the neighbor who had filmed the demolition, waving to him. She was leading a group of about 20 people, all wearing matching blue t-shirts with Millfield Neighbors printed across the front. We brought sandwiches for everyone, Judy explained as she approached. And my husband's company is donating all the electrical work for the new building. Jim thanked her, genuinely moved by the gesture. Just weeks ago, these same neighbors had been at a meeting where Patricia convinced them his property was an eyesore. Now they were bringing lunch and offering to rewire his building. Across the site, Frank Johnson, the retired postal worker who had first spotted the bulldozers, was showing a group of younger veterans how to properly frame a window. Despite being in his 70s, Frank had shown up every day since the cleanup began, often staying later than men half his age. My father was in Korea with your grandfather, Frank had explained to Jim. He always said Caldwell parts were the best, never failed when you needed them. By midday, the site was transformed into something resembling an old-fashioned barn raising. Children ran about delivering water bottles to thirsty workers. Someone had brought a portable grill and was cooking hot dogs. Music played from a radio, adding to the festive atmosphere. Jim climbed onto a stack of lumber to address the volunteers during their lunch break. I can't thank you all enough, he began, his voice thick with emotion. What Patricia Wilkinson did was terrible, but what you all are doing now, this is the true spirit of community. A cheer went up from the crowd. Someone shouted, "What about Patricia? Any news?" Jim nodded, his expression turning serious. The legal proceedings are ongoing. But I wanted you all to know that I've been working on something in the Senate, a bill to strengthen HOA regulations and prevent this kind of overreach from happening again. The crowd murmured their approval. Jim had spent the past month drafting legislation that would create clearer boundaries for HOA authority, establish stronger penalties for violations, and require better education for HOA board members before they could take office. The Wilkinsons' house went on the market yesterday, Pete added quietly as Jim climbed down. Ton told me they're moving back to Ohio. Patricia took a plea deal, probation and community service, plus paying for the damages. Jim nodded, watching the volunteers return to work. He felt no satisfaction in the Wilkinsons' downfall. The whole situation was unfortunate, driven by Patricia's misguided sense of authority and complete disregard for the facts. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn day, the rebuilt factory wing stood complete. Its brick exterior matched the original building, but inside was a state-of-the-art training facility with computer stations, manufacturing equipment, and classroom space. 100 people gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The mayor spoke briefly, followed by a representative from the Veterans Affairs Office. Finally, it was Jim's turn. "This building has always been about building things that last," Jim said, looking out at the faces of those who had helped make this day possible. "My grandfather built parts for tractors and tanks. My father built industrial components. Today, we're building something different. We're building new beginnings for the men and women who served our country." He cut the ribbon to enthusiastic applause. As people filed inside to tour the facility, a local reporter approached Jim for a comment. "Senator Caldwell, many are calling this a feel-good story about a community coming together. How do you see it?" Jim thought for a moment, looking at the building that had been nearly destroyed and was now better than before. "Sometimes it takes something being broken for people to realize its value," he said. "This isn't just about rebuilding a factory. It's about remembering that a community isn't defined by property values or perfect lawns. It's defined by how we treat each other, especially when things go wrong." Inside, the first class of veterans was already exploring the facility that would help them build their new futures, moving around what had once been called an eyesore but was now the pride of Millfield.